This is the Books Podcast presented by Tim Hague.
Education has been a convenient scapegoat for all the other failures in society. Everybody can see through the Emperor's new clothes. We just need to find a way of getting rid of the Emperor.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
Okay, something of a departure for us here at Books Podcast. Most books in the education section of the bookshop are on the dry side. The People's Republic of Neverland, though, is anything but. It's a fiery, polemical blast of anger and passion. Robb Johnson is a teacher with a panoramic vision of best practice in education, and I don't think I'm giving too much away if I say that it doesn't really boil down to endless testing in sterile exam factories. Rob, thank you for having us.
Absolutely, yes.
Let's start with that title, The People's Republic of Neverland, The Child versus the State. That child versus, you mean that literally?
Yes, I do, yeah. I think that education has lost sight of the fact that the most important part of education is the child. And since the introduction of the national curriculum and all that's gone with it, the state has positioned itself as the ultimate arbiter of what should take place in schools, and the interests of the state have been placed above the interests of the child. So it is I think anybody in education has to decide which side they're on. Are they on the side of the child or are they on the side of the state? Well,
most education secretaries would argue and insist that they were convergent, that the interests of the state and the interests of the child were broadly similar. Surely what we all want is for the child to get a good education and for the state to end up with educated and well-rounded individuals.
That was a different state you're talking about there. That's a completely different state to the neoliberal state. And that was the state that existed maybe in the period of the post-war consensus, and of course since Thatcher and the resurgence of the right, that's not what they want at all. What they want is docile. In a way, they want to turn state education back to its original function, which was to provide in the 19th century a workforce that was educated just enough to person the factories or be clerks in counting houses or whatever. So the state is basically reasserting the idea that the state uses education as a tool to create the populace it wants. So it stopped obviously, as you mentioned, testing as well. It stopped the idea that education is about drawing out the potential from each individual, which is actually what the word education comes from. Educare means to draw out potential, but simply to measure people and grade them and make sure that they can be stamped as useful or not to the state. And in doing this, also, that I would say that the state disables people by teaching them, by giving them anti-educational experiences. When we have a state that has a phobia with, it's quite funny, isn't it? With reading skills, at the same time as we have a state that has happily had the support of and relies upon the support of the tabloid press to act as its propaganda machine.
You within the book, and in a slightly different context, you quote Michael Rosen as saying that the literature has given way to literacy, and that's all part and parcel of this process that you say. Let's go back, because you do a bit of the history of this, and it's not quite a golden age, but there was a brief window, you're suggesting, between the war and Thatcherism, when radical pedagogy was on the agenda at least, and there were developments. We never really got to the golden sunny uplands, but tell me about that, and perhaps we can also weave in. Many of our listeners will have completely forgotten the William Tyndale School, but perhaps that might be a way of explaining some of the background. And
it also that brings us to the point when the state went, hang on, what are we paying for here? As we can look back historically, and we can see that that you have a general tendency to democratisation within society, whether that's allowing women to vote or whether it's allowing people to be educated. And of course, with the with the creation of the welfare state, Beveridge report, that argued that everybody should have access to education and healthcare and housing in 1945. People within education started paying a proper attention to how and what we teach our children. There are several government commissions. I can't remember the names, but they're in the book. And interestingly enough, they're composed sometimes of the great and good, but also they're composed from people who know what they're talking about. People who are educationalists. It's not policy decided by think tank, by the Sutton Trust, which of course is the think tank that was set up by Michael Gove in 2011 to come up with the kind of reports that basically validate or encourage government political policy. But there was a general interest in how you make sure that every child gets the education they deserve. And gradually, you're right, radical pedagogy started finding its way into state schools. The ideas that, of course, the rich had always enjoyed. Obviously, the rich send their children to some schools where they just get buggered and beaten as usual. But there are some places within the private sector. The history of kind of radical education that goes back to free schools and Steiner schools, and of course Summerhill. That are
You're going to have to say what Summerhill was, because that was new to me.
Oh well, Summerhill is like it's the classic beacon of English progressive education. It was established by A.S. Neal, who is a pretty progressive. He's a very child-centred progressive thinker, and Summerhill was a school where children were engaged in decision making. They were encouraged to, all ages were encouraged to be part of like a democratic process. They talked about what they were going to do. They accepted responsibility for what they were going to do, and education was voluntary, if you like, rather than imposed. And children had agency over how they were taught. Summerhill is the great moment in the English tradition where progressives actually get hold of an institution and create something. And people working the state system, I know the school I first worked at had several people who'd looked at Summerhill and thought, yes, look, this is what we do. You engage children. You don't treat children like they are either dogs to be ordered about, or in Dickens's Hard Times, little pitchers to be filled with facts. You recognise that children are sentient and intelligent beings who bring something to education, and you give them agency and choice over how they structure their learning.
But isn't there a problem though that if you make it child centric and allow the children to dictate, as it were, their own learning, they're going to avoid the hard things? And I want to remind our listeners, you are a teacher, so this is not a theoretical thing.
No.
This is not an idea that you pulled out of a book.
No, this is my experience that actually people learn best when they have
a case though that kids will go, well, I find French really hard, I'm not going to do any languages.
I think the difference is that if you treat people with respect, actually, I'm not sure that I would say I'm not sure that people need to be made to learn French. I think people need to be given an education experience that encourages their and substantiates their natural inclination to learn, so that, for example, when they do come across things like maths, which I can't stand, and French, which you might find difficult, they don't go, I'm not doing that. They go, I'll have a bash at that. You might not become an expert at it, but you might want to have a go at it. You might decide, actually, and I think this is absolutely right, you might decide, actually, what I'm really good at, I'm really interested in, is something called geography. So I'd like to spend more time doing that, please. So of course, there is a basic... there's always an assumption that children need a basic level of skills. However, if you think about, for example, taking maths as an example of something a lot of people have difficulty with, I think a lot of people have difficulty with maths because it's taught too early on as an abstract, meaningless language. And we find that I think most of the maths we use, we've learnt by the age of 11. Most people go into jobs they certainly use their maths that they learn, by the time they've learnt the concept of times tables. So you don't make people do things they don't want to do. The school I first worked in, it kind of acknowledged that it had a kind of responsibility to encourage children to address all areas of learning. So the voluntary nature was that the children could decide how much time they spent in each curriculum area. And so if they did want to spend a lot of time on science and geographical, they spent most of the week doing science and geographical and then scampered through their maths at a bare minimum later on. But the important thing to remember is if you treat people as responsible individuals, and if you make learning enjoyable, then all those kind of problems of children sort of refusing to do things they don't like, I think that's quite sensible. You know, if you don't like something and it just doesn't, why make people do more of what they're not very good at?
Well,
it's counterproductive, isn't it?
Well, of course, you make this point by referring it forward to the present regime and this sort of exam factory, this constant testing thing, and I would think of it in terms of French rather than maths.
Yeah,
because what you get now is that children will spend years learning French, getting a GCSE, and then promptly forget every word of French at the end of the exam. Now, that's wasted time.
Yes, absolutely.
Unless you regard the qualification as justification in itself.
Well, they do, don't they? That's the kind of almost antediluvian idea of education that it shows you're good. If you make people do something they're not very good at, and they can get a pass in it, then it shows their aptitude for doing whatever you throw at them. In the past, the testing regime was actually diagnostic. You did a test, and so you came up with some GCSEs or O levels, and I said, Johnson, he's okay at literature. Johnson did particularly badly in chemistry because he's not very good at that, and and that's go. But now all children are expected to pass all exams, whether they have a natural aptitude for it or not, whether for the area of learning. So it is just about passing exams for passing exams' sake, and of course that makes it so joyless. It makes learning purely a mechanical.
It's also an unrealistic expectation, isn't it?
Every year above average.
You can't have rising results year on year.
No. It's a fiction, isn't it? It's total fiction. It sounds good to a Daily Mail reader, but in the real world, it's just...
It's worse than a fiction, though, isn't it? It's a lie. You say in the book, rising test results don't improve kids' employment prospects, but they do wonders for the head teachers' employment prospects. And what the right wing would say is that doing well at school is going to provide you with a better job, and it's going to make everybody more employable. But that's only true if the jobs are there.
Yes, one of the things that has happened since the 80s is that education has been a convenient scapegoat for all the other failures in society. The fact you can't get a job, it's because you were badly educated, not because there aren't any jobs there, not because British industry has been actually hammered into extinction. No one makes anything. It's all service industries anymore. You're right. I must stop being so kind and calling it a fiction, but it is a lie that that school can fix society. Let's assume that everybody comes out of school miraculously with magnificently wonderful grades. What are they going to do with them? Where are they going to be employed? Because we know that the employment isn't there. We know lots of people who even leave school, go to university, come out with some kind of degree, and still can't get any kind of employment because we have a state that doesn't actually want to employ people, doesn't want to give people well-paid jobs where they can work together.
No, because poor people are more profitable to the financial industry.
Yeah.
And the other side of this, of course, is the similar lie of social mobility. People always like to trumpet social mobility as though this is a good thing. We're going to get some poor kids into grammar schools.
Oh, yes.
But all you're doing really is rearranging the victims.
Yeah,
because unless there is enough jobs and enough employment and enough prospects, then you're selecting the deserving poor.
You are the deserving poor. Or we think you might be useful, so out you come from the abyss. Off you go to grammar school. Off you go to Oxford, and you lot. Well, we don't care. You just stay there, and you're undeserving because you didn't pass the tests we wanted to set for you to pass, and that's yeah, that keeps, and also if you have a system of education that is outcome based and that deliberately disables people intellectually and indeed linguistically, then you have a work population that is unlikely to get itself organised. It won't get itself into trade unions, won't cause the government any trouble, might riot occasionally, but won't have but won't necessarily have acquired any kind of language or sense of worth that makes them effectively resistant. I got a great quotation from Louise Michel, the heroine of the Paris Commune, teaches the obscure foot soldiers of the revolution. They give people the intellectual means by which to revolt.
I can hear a voice over my shoulder, though, insidiously saying, what is wrong with education being useful? Don't we need engineers, lab technicians, care home administrators? So what is wrong with education being useful?
Well, education is useful, isn't it? But it should be seen as being useful to the individual, because useful individuals then are useful to the state. Automatons aren't particularly useful to the state, but useful individuals, and they're useful to their own lives. I have been fortunate enough to have spent what seems like several lifetimes working as a teacher, and what this has given me is an experience of working with umpteen. I did calculate how many children I've worked with, and it was quite a lot. And I've never met one who wasn't interested in learning. In the early years, I'd never met one who didn't come into who wasn't able to come into a school saying, "Okay, come on, let's do something interesting." With them.
At which point I can still hear that voice over my shoulder suggesting that some of the book reads a tad utopian. You don't believe in punishment, for one thing.
That's difficult.
At one point,
That's difficult.
I wrote this down. Children are essentially instinctively kind.
Yeah.
And you also wrote, I also wrote down, I've got right under there, the minimum age of teachers ought to include that all children go home happy. There isn't a utopian note in this?
No, I think that's realistic. That's good education. That's good practice.
And
why would you want to make somebody unhappy? What's the point of making somebody unhappy? I mean, realistically, why would you want to make somebody unhappy? They'll only come back the next day because they'll be forced to, and they'll be resistant. They'll be unhappy, and you'll have to overcome their unhappiness. And children are kind.
And children are kind, and you never need punishment.
Difficult. I think punishment within schools is a very difficult question. There's a constant tension between the child and the way the child views itself as received by the world around it. And as children get older, they realise that their world doesn't care for them, particularly now. They realise they might live at the wrong end of the streets. They realise they might have a dysfunctional family. They realise they're living in a dysfunctional society, and they feel angry. And so when people are angry, when people's needs aren't met, then obviously they behave in antisocial ways. If you're in a society that doesn't value you, quite rightly, you behave in antisocial ways. So if you're in a school that just values the exam results, you're not good at exams, then you're not gonna feel engaged. You're going to be antisocial.
But in your vision, we'd fix all this earlier.
Yeah.
So that they wouldn't need to get to the point of needing to be punished.
Yeah, and you need to make sure that you have a system that engages with people's interests. And it is, I believe that why do people behave badly? It's when their needs aren't met. Too much attention has been paid to behaviour. Too much attention is paid to behaviour. Those governments setting up behaviour centres, and again, that's kind of like, it doesn't address the cause; it addresses the symptom. Why are people so unhappy that they are disaffected at school? And punishing them or giving them some kind of behavioural boot camp is just in a way giving them more of the.
And then of course you end up with an academy that's excluding a third of its students. Which can't be right.
Yeah, no, it's not right. You need to make sure that you have a system that welcomes the child and values the child, and if you do that, then I think if you concentrate on relationships, on explaining reasonably, and don't just simply impose an arbitrary, frankly bullying authority that so many schools feel they have to. That's a historical model. then if people feel at home in their environment, why would they wish to behave badly in their environment? Why would they wish to engage in antisocial behaviour? You just, very few people actually want to shit in their own houses, do they? And if they do, something's gone wrong. We must try and work out ways of fixing things before they go wrong, addressing the cause rather than the symptom.
And because of that, this is, in its own way, a really optimistic book, insofar as you have a vision of how things could be and almost have been, even though the current state is fairly parlous and dysfunctional.
The current state is exhausted. The current state has prolonged itself. It played its joker with the neoliberals played their joker with Brexit, and that distracted so much attention from the awful failures of austerity, the awful failures of their education system. There are increasing demands from parents for a creative curriculum, for a child-centered, for their children to be valued in schools. That's an increasing movement. It's probably a middle-class kind of movement, but it's still a movement. And everybody knows that the exam factories don't work. We know that our children in schools are more stressed. They're more afraid of exam failure than they are of bullying. It's a kind of a strange thing. Everybody's known that, but of course, Brexit distracted attention away from the failures of neoliberalism, and then COVID, of course, has been another gift for basically a bankrupt political system, because they now talk about the need to catch up. They moved the argument away from what is actually happening in our schools. What are our children actually learning and doing in our schools to, they must catch up. So in a way, I'm surprised. No, we should never be surprised at the way that capitalism and the neoliberal state manages to prolong itself by any means necessary. But when I started writing the book, it was clear, wasn't it? It is clear that certainly the condemned government is exhausted. Politically, it's bankrupt. So that's why it's optimistic, because everybody can see through the emperor's new clothes. We just need to find a way of getting rid of the emperor.
Well, The People's Republic of Neverland, The Child versus the State by Robb Johnson is published by PM Press at £17.99 here, $20 in America, where it's also available. And of course, there's a Kindle at $4.99, the cheapest option. Rob, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
That was Books Podcast, presented by Tim Haig. Books Podcast is a Green Shoot production. You can find out more at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.